Hello and welcome back to Crypto Sapiens. I am your host, Humpty Calderon. And today we are talking to Zakk, core contributor at Coordinape. Coordinape spreads the decision-making power to the fringes so that everyone in an organization has an opportunity to recognize and reward their peers. Leaving a note to the people that you are recognizing on Coordinape has become an intrinsic motivator, according to Zakk. People might forget how many give they got or who they allocated to, but they always remember how many notes they've received and from whom. That feedback is important to make people feel valued. About building in Web3, Zakk says, we can actually make it reflect the system we want to participate in and create systems that better reflect our values. There's lots to unpack here. So without further ado, let's get started.
All right. Well, I'm Zakk. I come from Cascadia, which is Portland, Oregon, is where I was born and raised, and I now live in Guanacaste on the west coast of Costa Rica. I moved here a couple of years ago with my family. And I'd say, my professional life has been all geared around sort of a saner way to live and collaboration. So basically, sustainability, systems change, like these are the things I focused on. I was a sustainability consultant for Fortune 50 companies for several years, working on, sustainability strategy, programming, communications, working with Apple and Dell and Intel and their tier one suppliers on how to increase sustainability in their supply chain. That work led me to see that everyone recognizes the necessity of collaboration and loves the idea of collaboration, but are really bad at actually collaborating, and often ignore like the significant, I'd say, overhead that collaborating brings. And so that led me to co-found a consultancy called Converge, which was focused on basically bringing together stakeholders from the public, private, and social sectors together to address systemic issues. So how do we steward 500,000 acres of redwoods, right? When we have many different owners and many different worldviews on what stewardship means. So we would bring all those people together. How I describe it now is basically we were making IRL DAOs. So we were bringing together a bunch of different stakeholders that all cared about this thing and turning them into a community that could identify, leverage points in the system so that they could get some things done that had to happen at a system scale, right? If I'm clearing all the invasives out of my patch of ground and you're not, then it's useless because they're just going to come right back over. So we have to collaborate toward these shared goals. So I did Converge. We grew that for about 8 years. And then right around the time of kind of in the depths of COVID and just wanting a break, I sort of set myself up for a sabbatical and was inadvertently led into the world of DeFi, but especially DAOs. And once I discovered those, just kind of like, swan dive down the rabbit hole. And it felt like a way to sort of scale the work we'd been doing at Converge, doing these impact networks, but online, and ways to do that asynchronously and globally. And one of the ways that we paid each other at Converge, so Converge actually operated a lot like a DAO as well. There was no one on payroll. There was no employees. We were all just independent entities that would come together to do these projects, kind of under the Converge brand. But when we would invoice a client, the project team would put the money in the middle of the table, and then we'd have a conversation about who should get what based on what we did. And that had the benefit both of being more fair in terms of the people that had the most value got the most pay, but it also turned out to just be really good team hygiene, really good way to get real-time feedback from people that had watched you work, and to give real-time feedback. It really builds trust and flushes out like those little micro resentments that sort of can build up over time in any relationship. Just kind of give a place to flush those out. And so as I started contributing at Yearn, ended up sort of seeing the challenge they were having with kind of the grant committee and, how is the grant committee deciding who gets grants and why are we the ones on this grant committee? That was never decided. And so we said, well, why not let the community decide, who should get these grants? And so we built a very V1-ish, V0-ish version of Coordinape. And from there, kind of it was really solving a problem that a lot of DAOs have. And then we kind of went all in on it. So I've been working on Coordinape full time for the past year and a half, almost. Yeah, year and a half. Wow. Almost 2 years.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you were doing the work that you're doing at Coordinape long before Coordinape existed. I know.
Oh, for sure. I mean,
I know this piece, but I'd like for you, if you wouldn't mind, to dive a little bit into kind of the theory or the philosophy of, Coordinape and this gifting and this kind of spreading the incentives to the fringes that really is at the root of Coordinape and that had already been established in some way already previously at Yearn and at Converge.
So I take a lot of inspiration from a few different sort of, I guess, lineages of thought, but a lot of what Frederick Laloux sort of tied together and pointed to in Reinventing Organizations around, harnessing collective intelligence, around, trusting the people who are making the decisions with the power to own and those decisions, was really inspired by a lot of the ways that a lot of the companies that he points to in that book, and the way that it's like, he kind of has that apocryphal example, you can create a big elaborate system to keep people from, taking tools at the wrong time out of the warehouse, or you can just have a sign that says return the tools. And, if one goes missing, that's still vastly cheaper than this big tracking system. So pushing decisions to the edges, pushing trust to the edges. And then also, positive psychology. And there's obviously a big body of work that, telling somebody thank you for the work they've done and really getting them recognized is a huge boost to their intrinsic motivation. And we know that intrinsic motivation is like vastly more powerful than extrinsic. And so, really tried to build Coordinape as much as a cultural tool than as a compensation tool, and really trying to put gratitude at the heart of it. And we've seen, the user feedback. I always say it's like people kind of might forget how many give they got or who they allocated to, but they always know exactly how many notes they got and who they got them from. And I think because we especially work in this sort of more, async, pseudo-anon world, like having that feedback directly of like this thing you're doing is appreciated and matters is hyper valuable for people. And so we really tried to build, positive psychology, gratitude, and intrinsic motivation as sort of the key pillars in how the tool works. So it does do compensation, but that's not really, I feel like, where the actual value is. The actual value is in kind of creating that flywheel of connection and appreciation and then performance.
I've definitely I'm a part of several circles using Coordinape, and I hear frequently one of the more thrilling and memorable, to your point, experiences of using it is that thank you note. It's that, ability to kind of recognize others, not just through, remuneration in some token, but also recognition and appreciation simply using words. And I think it's definitely very impactful. I've definitely received some, definitely sent some, and heard from the communities that I'm part of that is probably one of the more exciting things of that. Another thing that if you're using Coordinape, you have access to is that visual representation of connections, right? Between individuals in an organization. I think it's really cool to see the visualization of these connections across the entire organization, but also these connections deepening or strengthening over time, right? I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it because we work in a very digital world, right? Where we're probably in a Discord somewhere, or we're using some other communication platform, but we rarely work in person. So to be able to look to that and see how your connections have grown over time, I think it's hugely important.
Yeah, and we have some cool stuff on our roadmap as far as really enhancing the sort of engagement around that map, like what it can do, what it can show. So being able to sort of show all-time give, for example, and to show sort of evolutions over time. We've seen some pretty cool prototypes of like watching the first circle and then just putting it in sequence and seeing how it grows and changes. So yeah, I feel like we've only kind of scratched the surface of the kind of cool stuff that map can do. And another thing that we've been thinking a lot about, and this is always kind of the hard thing, like we want to really keep it simple. I think doing one thing well has been one of the strengths of Coordinape. But are there other kinds of give? We've toyed around with the idea of like there's give, which are attached to the budget, and then there's props, which aren't, but really allow you to sort of show that connection and gratitude piece. But to the point earlier, it's kind of like this: the notes and compensation really work together. I feel like if it wasn't for the compensation, it kind of becomes more of a fluffy toy, right? And you're like, oh yeah, give kudos, like say thanks to people, but like you'll do that once, but it's not something you're going to really prioritize and make time for. When you have this limited number of give that you're sharing with people, and you're making tough choices, there's never kind of enough give to really thank everybody. But that forced prioritization kind of adds stakes to it that make the whole thing more meaningful, because it costs you something to do, and that's the notes sort of work together with that.
I think what you're talking about is there are different types of incentives we can use to recognize each other's contributions. There's financial incentives, and I think give is a good representation of that. It's thank you so much for the work that we did this season, this month, however long your epoch goes on for. And there's a note which goes along with that give, but it's a different type of incentive. Like there's that just recognition, that note of appreciation, the effort, the time is what you recognize there, not just the money that gets dispersed at the end of that, at the end of that epoch. But now you're talking about like props potentially being another way to incentivize, contributions and cooperation or coordination.
As potential sort of. And I should emphasize that this is not something that's on our roadmap. It's just something we've played with and talked about a lot because there is this desire, like how do I recognize people more? We've also talked about like things like having each person has a golden give, like you have one that you can give out during each epoch to really like shine a light on somebody and recognize them. Maybe mint an NFT to send to them. So those are all things that we're excited to nail down and put out. But yeah, just overall, I'd say how do we increase more that recognition and connection and those drivers of intrinsic motivation? Because not just for the warm fuzzies, which are nice, but really because we know that that's what drives team performance, right? I mean, I've spent a lot of time with the research and literature, and we know that psychological safety, equal contributions, these are the things that are kind of the hallmarks of performance across all different kinds of contexts, and intrinsic motivation, obviously. So how can we make sure we're increasing those, or at least contributing to increasing those within teams? It's kind of a cliche. It's a little bit trite. And, everyone in Web3, we love to talk about the vibes. But it's really true, right? Like culture eats strategy for breakfast, and teams that vibe are also really high performing teams. And so, the more that we can up those, it's not just a nice to have. It really is kind of the bedrock that good results are built on.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've hit a moment in Web3 where we're seriously considering that intrinsic motivation, right? Where we're really trying to be thoughtful about what is it that can incentivize someone, what is it that can reward someone fairly, right? And then retain them to want to do this work, right? Because it's a lot of effort to do the work that we do in DAOs and in Web3. So it's really great to hear that, at least the conversations are ongoing over at Coordinape in terms of like looking at the entire Web3 ecosystem to see how incentives or compensation, right, can work. I was actually really fascinated by the discussion that happened, like I told you earlier, over at MCon 2, where you and a few other folks were on stage and talking about compensation. What do you think? This is, just your thoughts, doesn't have to be like what Coordinape is doing about it, but what do you think we need to improve to do compensation better? Because I hear people talking about bounties, but I also hear people saying bounties are not enough. We hear the talk about role pay, but sometimes role pay may put someone in a position where they don't have flexibility, right? And obviously, I think Coordinape floats in between all of those things where there is this, continuous way of like remunerating people, recognizing people that is outside of those two things. Do you think it needs to be more of one, more of the other, a balance of all three, or something else?
I mean, when we're talking at that broad a high level, it seems like all three has to be the answer. There are some things that are very transactional. Bounties make a lot of sense. We see that all the time in our daily lives. It's like, this is how much this costs to do this thing. Like, okay, done. That's a bounty. And so, I definitely think bounties have their place for like very defined, deliberate work. Like, I need X amount of these. Okay, great, done. And anyone can pick it up. That makes sense for a lot of things, and obviously for a lot of things it doesn't. For more subjective, creative work, like bounties are terrible. Coordinape is great, I think, for that kind of work that's sort of ongoing and creative and subjective, where you're really getting that feedback from your team about the value that you're adding. And that can help steer you toward doing more of something or less of something, to really, help you find what your gifts are to share and what they appreciate. Coordinape can be a useful sort of compass in your ikigai journey. And then, there's also like a lot of times an important need for just, some salary, a version of a salary, right? Like, I have kids, I have bills, and I need, I need some sort of certainty on that this is what's happening. In that sense, I feel like one of the biggest problems in Web3 is revenue. That would solve a lot of compensation issues. We're building for a future. We're super early, and we're building for a future that isn't here yet. And so, we don't have hordes of users that are paying for the things that we're building. Outside of the Uniswaps of the world, but they're outside of some select DeFi DAOs. A lot of the DAO tools, a lot of people that are being built are certainly not profitable, not yet. And we all are obviously here because we think they will be. We think this is the future, and it definitely is. But it's obviously that the analogy is the early days of the internet. Like, they were all right about the internet, but they may not have been right about the business model, and they were there for it too soon, or all these things. So there's always going to be a mix of compensation that makes sense depending on the context. I think Coordinape is a really a novel one in the sense, again, of it's a mindset shift of really getting away from this pyramid mindset, that we get from a very young age. First it's our parents are the boss, and we're the kids, and then you have the principal and the teacher and the students, and then you have the boss and the managers and the work, and there's even governments work this, everything, sort of all of our human systems, when we look around, predominantly, especially in the Western world, have all been designed around this sort of pyramid structure. And so this mindset shift of taking responsibility, which is both really empowering and really imposing. This is, the real power of Web3 is the sovereignty that it increases, and saying, no, you're responsible for, the results of the DAO. You're responsible for what you get paid and what other people's get paid. And there's obviously, pros and cons that go along with that approach. But I think that mindset shift is the most important thing, and in some ways the hardest.
You touched on something there that I think we can explore a little bit further. And you were talking about, this this lack of revenue, us being early. And we talked a little bit about this even before we, kind of kicked off the podcast. So we're in this space where we are trying to increase adoption of Web3. I think we're all really talking to the same people across all of the different projects. We're all still engaging the same folks over and over and over again. I think less so about how we can gain adoption for Web3, and more so about how do we communicate the value of what it is that we're building to someone who has no idea what is a DAO, someone who has no idea of these different mechanisms of compensation, right? Like using Coordinape as an example, where you as an employee could actually remunerate and recognize someone else sitting across from you. What are some of the things you think that we could do better when it comes to communicating this so that others can get that same excitement that we have and want to be a part of this ecosystem that we're building?
I guess, I don't know if this is what we should do, but sort of my dream is that we're able to sort of collectively create this a shared narrative. And it's really about, to me, I love the paraphrasing, Buckminster Fuller, he says, don't fight against the old paradigm, create a new one so that makes the old one obsolete. And I sort of say that as throw a better party. We don't have to fight against the old system. Just throw a better party and people will show up there eventually. And you don't have to convince anyone of anything. You don't have to, do change management. It's just no, we're just going to go over here and have more fun. You'll come eventually. And I feel this is obviously tinged with a lot of idealism and naivete, but Web3 does have the ability to create some fundamentally new systems, new structures, new ways of organizing, new ways of incentivizing, new ways of tokenizing value, and trading value and sharing value and incentivizing the production of value. I think we all see this. And, especially with younger generations, but I think almost everyone, we look at all of the predominant institutions in our world, and they're all sort of, busted beyond repair and kind of beyond incremental change. Whether it's government or education or healthcare or criminal justice, like whatever it is, you look at it and you're like, that is just like, what a mess. And the idea that we could actually create new systems that have different flow throughs of value and different ways to allocate value, is idealistic, but I think that's the kind of story that can really speak to people and bring them. And I think aside from the sort of casino mania of crypto hype cycles and the bull run, I think it's those value sets that are really going to bring people and create that core of culture that as it grows more, that we really want at the center of it. I certainly felt that and saw that at DevCon. I think the work that Owaki is doing with, Green Pill and Gitcoin in general, really talking about public goods and bringing those forward. There's a lot of projects I could name that I think are building that narrative. That's really important. And I think there's so much to be pessimistic about, that having a sort of optimistic, like, we actually don't have to do systems change. We can just do systems invention. That's exciting to me. That's a very exciting narrative. Recognizing that it's much easier said than done, and the devil's in the details is very hard to do. But we kind of don't have a choice. It's like the situation is far too dire to be pessimistic at this stage. Like, we really need to find an optimistic story that says we're going to be able to navigate the next, 30 years of sort of escalating radical change.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think with what you said, and I think that we would do better if we had a shared narrative that we can all build upon and participate in. And I agree too. I'm a big fan of what, Kevin Owaki is doing over, with Green Pilled, and, the work that he has done over at Gitcoin previously. And, I think he's someone who I think is a good storyteller. And he's able to share these very complex ideas in very fun and accessible ways, right? Like very deconstructing this very technical space and doing it in a way where you can say, oh, I can relate to that. And sometimes doing it where...
Yeah. Yes. Memes are the new stories.
Which is my very long way of trying to get to exactly that, is telling stories through memes, right? Short form, quality content that hooks you, that can go viral. I think, I agree. I think that there's a lot of opportunity here for us to kind of build this shared meme, right? I know there are some projects that talk about Moloch, and I think that for the most part, a lot of people have bought into that, right? Defeating Moloch, this crosses different projects. It doesn't just necessarily have to do with DAOs. It could be with DeFi. It could be with NFT marketplace, whatever. Like it really encompasses this idea of like coordination and being able to do better together. I guess I wanted to kind of pick at this a little bit more because we also opened with this conversation about co-opetition and about doing better together in the space of Web3, and hopefully doing so before Web2 companies wake up and say, oh, this makes sense. And thank you for all the work that you've done, Coordinape, Gitcoin, every project that's been building for years, this future upon this philosophy of shared values and regenerative growth. I wonder if you can maybe talk a little bit about the ways that Coordinape engages other projects to work collaboratively. I think you were talking about DAOkit earlier, where there's these different projects that have come together to at least think through some of these challenges together and maybe build in some sort of unified strategy.
Mm-hmm. I think, collaboration is obviously a deep value for a lot of people in this space. And we're also like products trying to get users and trying to figure out, how we can become self-sustaining. And everybody's doing that. I think, again, back to like the throw a better party, I do think there's at least a value in a real, the new winning is the squad wealth kind of idea. It's like, you don't want to be Facebook where it's like, yes, we've vertically integrated everything and everything happens here in all our walled garden, and you kind of have these competing ecosystems. As opposed to, it's like, wow, there's sort of enough for everyone, and it's better to have 100 projects doing well than one project that's a ultra mega unicorn. I think that's just a value that sort of permeates things, which again is easy to say, but then the conversation at DAOkit, again, and we're essentially a collection of people building DAO tools, is sort of really getting down into the details that are really hard. It's like, what is the user experience of having 8 front ends that they need to navigate in order to just, do the work of their DAO? How do those things talk to each other? Do we all collectively somehow fund a sort of neutral front end DAO dashboard that kind of plugs into everything in the back? Well, then wait. What happens when someone's using a tool that isn't part of the funding? Like these are when you get then in the nitty gritty, obviously the details get very, very challenging. But I think what's important and what's interesting is the commitment to work on it. I've seen in my work in the sustainability world, you rarely see companies coming together to try and solve things that don't have a sort of PR angle or some sort of ROI. Ultimately they're like, we have to win. We have to show continual growth, and we have to win. And it's sort of like, I guess what's interesting to me in Web3 is we're sort of re-exploring what are the win conditions, and like what is enough. And is there a way where we can all do good and no one has to sort of be the winner? We can all win. Like, is that possible? I think is a real legitimate question. And it's just cool to be in these conversations and sort of understand, like, yeah, let's integrate. Okay, but like, where does the interaction happen? Is it on, are people doing this using your product on Coordinape, or are people on your site using Coordinape? What are the implications of that? Do we care? What happens when all of us are mature and 5 years from now, we're all sort of leading our category and getting tight. We have ideas for other things we want to do, but it starts stepping on each other's toes. Where the rubber meets the road, how much will these values hold? Or how much will we say like, the co-opetition, but we're going to be in more competition now than cooperation. I think it's just interesting to have that as an open question, as opposed to just the obvious default in sort of, default world business. You're like, win, crush the competition. You're competing. It's sort of, you have to win your category, all these things. It's like, well, maybe. But maybe there's another way of doing things.
Yeah, I don't know why in my head it's ringing kind of the protocols that comprise the internet, and how maybe in the beginning there was this idea of like one protocol to win them all. But like, talking about like TCP/IP, HTTPS, like all these different protocols that are absolutely crucial to having the internet work. How when we put these things together, we have a usable internet, right? I wonder if we can look at Web3 development from a similar lens. I think it's a lot more, broad in terms of the different utility of these products, and protocols. But looking at it as, in order for Web3 to be usable, to be widely adopted, we need to create standards, and the standard could be Coordinape, but also find ways to linking that up to other protocols so that when you see Web3 from a high level, you don't think about HTTPS, right? But you think about just being able to log into a website securely, right? You think about being able to, if Coordinape continues on the road that it is, being able to use it as some sort of compensation tool that also sets some sort of culture tone in organizations, right? But at the same time, you can use the entirety of the Web3 ecosystem in ways that are synergistic and collaborative, so that it all just makes sense. You're just using the web in that case.
Mm-hmm. And that gets to the mindset shift, is it's the cool parts about DAOKit are sort of well, what if we had, token gating, or just if you have a certain NFT badge that automatically allows you into a certain Coordinape circle? That's a lot to build. No, don't worry. There's other protocols that have already built this. You just have to plug it in. Oh, great. Well, what about, doing back-end payroll stuff, the distribution? Oh no, we can integrate with folks that are doing that. And reputation. When we first started Coordinape, we sort of saw this oh wow, and people have their profiles and Give is this super high signal reputational marker. It could be the LinkedIn of Web3. And now it's as we look at it, it's sort of well, no, we're just the supplier of an extremely valuable reputation oracle and are happy to share it with all the people that are really building a lot more elaborate and complete reputational infrastructure. And in some ways, I hope that as Web3 gets built out, what it will look like is very similar to Web2, except just kind of a figure ground switch where it's now I've got my data backpack, shout out to Disco, but I'm showing up all these places and I can show up how I want to show up and interact with things there. And I can potentially participate in some of the upside in what I'm doing. And we can really just kind of, obviously the value that the internet, especially Web2 created, was pretty stunning. And accumulated to a lot of people who didn't really help build it and aren't actively building it. And a lot of people have obviously written about this a lot more eloquently, but Web3 Uber looks a lot like Web2 Uber, except the drivers are doing a lot better than investors. That's how I see Web3 really. It's what if it looked a lot like Web2, except the value accrual is a lot flatter. And that's where I feel the we're all going to make it meme was I've said this before, it's largely misunderstood, right? It's not we're all going to get rich, we're all going to make this thing. And that gets into, again, the mindset of being self-sovereign and recognizing we're building Web3 and we can actually make it, reflect the system that we want to participate in. We can create systems that better reflect our values. But it's hard, we kind of have to be the ones that show up to do it. Which to me really mirrors the broader global situation, while we're talking about tokens and all these things. I think the refi folks are really pointing to what is this all for? And I think we have to realize that there are no, governments or Paris Accords, or philanthropists that are going to come save us. We're going to have to figure out how we, deal with a lot of these global wicked problems that are going to only intensify.
Yeah, I like that. I think, at least for me, what I took away from that, it's a value shift, but it's also a culture shift from the way that we interact 100%. With our environment, the way that we see, the way that we see value in our relationships, the way that we see value in our work, the way that we see value in exchange of goods, even, for instance. where it isn't just hyper financialized, but there's a lot more that we can take away from that. And so maybe the call to action for all of us as developers is to look at it from the lens of the future we want to live in, from some of these like philosophical perspectives that we talk about in Web3. The tokens and sure, some of the financial things are important in order to make sure that we're compensating each other fairly, that we're, able to, kind of reward this ecosystem to flourish. But that's just a small piece of the puzzle. At the end of the day, there's a much bigger picture that we should all be looking towards. So I wonder if this is a good time to kind of ask you this question, because this is the question that I usually ask in closing. And is there something or someone that has been hugely influential to you in the way that you think and positioning you and the work that you do in this space the way that it does?
I think on one level, I could point to folks like, Janine Benyus from biomimicry, or, Buckminster Fuller, like these kind of thinkers that really work to open up like, different paradigms and ways of thinking about things. Biomimicry has been really, really influential in me and just how we think about systems and how they work, and recognizing that, nature has 4 billion years of R&D to learn from. In the space, I definitely have to shout out to Owaki, because it was their Bankless podcast with Slaying Moloch with him and Amin that I first was like, that's when I realized like, oh, this is what, crypto like is. And that really like changed my perception and got me, kind of down the DAO rabbit hole. And after that, like it's really like the team at Coordinape. I could shout out to every one of them. There's I think 11 or 12 of us. But the way that they have really like committed to like, this could be awesome. And, really trying to both smooth out the way it works and conceptualize how it could, but really committed to this idea of like, could we get to that sort of value in, value out ideal? And how can we support people kind of at every stage of that journey? I'm super impressed and grateful to the Coordinape team and the way that they are, not just doing the work, but are really thinking about the deeper questions in what we're building.
And that's a wrap. If you'd like to learn more about Zakk and Coordinape, you can follow them on Twitter at Fifth World Zakk and Coordinape, respectively. And don't forget to like and subscribe this podcast wherever you're listening to us, and give us a 5-star review. It really is an important way to get this content out to more people like you. And if you really enjoyed this conversation, please do go check out our archive at cryptosapiens.xyz. Until next time, stay brainy.